Salam, everyone. Hi, my name is Omar Aziz. I am the director for the Middle Eastern Student Center at the University of California, Riverside. I just want to welcome you all to day 2 of our symposium. Today, we have been focusing on culture and media of Afghanistan, particularly in the last 20 years. So we ended today with Dr. Wajma Osman's keynote speech talking about the different ways that the media has changed, and some of her research and her wonderful book specifically looking at television in Afghanistan and the media and journalism. So we were very grateful to have her with that wonderful keynote, and we are looking forward to tonight's panel to continue that conversation. So again, this is day 2 of the Afghanistan Symposium 20 years later. We are having this symposium 20 years to when the United States first occupied Afghanistan in 2001, October 7th, 2001. So yesterday we focused on the history of Afghanistan and what events and actions sort of got us to where we are today, and also looking at the ways history has kind of repeated itself in many ways. So today we focus on culture and media, and we want to make sure that we encourage you all to join us here on YouTube, to leave any questions, comments, any feedback you might have. Please, we encourage you to use the hashtags and of AFG UCR and AFG Symposium. If there's something you've learned or taken away from the program this week, and don't forget to tag MESC UCR. We are the Middle Eastern Student Center at UC Riverside. So we're pretty unique in that we have this type of space. It's an identity space on the University of California Riverside's campus, where we support Middle Eastern and SWANA students. And we're very lucky to have that here in Southern California. And we hope for many of you all who haven't been able to see us before, one day you can join us in person and we get to meet you all and come check us out on our campus and learn more about what we're doing. I want to make sure we also just, mention that part of what we want to do today is really expand on the knowledge of Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan. And in addition to taking part in this panel, we encourage everybody to also help us with supporting scholars in Afghanistan come to the US and continue their studies here and continue their scholarship and research here. So throughout the panel, we will be sharing a crowdfunding link that we encourage you all to check out. We are working together with the Scholars at Risk program and looking to fund 2 students to come to 2 faculty or students to come to UC Riverside and continue their education here, do research here, and work here. So we want to ask all of you to, in addition to listening, to consider donating and sharing that initiative with people that you might know who might be interested. We are talking to you, for many of us in the comforts of where we are today, and we want to make sure that I'm speaking from a university at this moment, and we want to make sure other folks have that opportunity to come and join us here. So thank you all again for joining. I'm very excited for tonight's panel, and we will be diving more deeply into the conversation that we just started today on the culture and media of Afghanistan with our esteemed guests. So without further ado, I will go ahead and begin to introduce our guests for tonight's panel. First, we have Dr. Mujgan Masumi, who is a historian of Afghanistan and currently a teaching fellow in the Civil, Liberal, and Global Education program at Stanford University, where she obtained her PhD in history from Stanford and a Master of City Planning and undergraduate degree in architecture from UC Berkeley. Her forthcoming monograph is on the history of radio and the politics of popular culture in Afghanistan from 1960 to 1979. Prior to her graduate studies, she served as the manager for the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at UC Berkeley, and her forthcoming article titled Radio in Afghanistan, Resistance Through Persianate Literary Cultural Production will appear in this Journal of Iranian Studies this year. So welcome, Dr. Masumi. Next, we have Azita Hatif from Emerson College. And Azita Jan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at Emerson College. Her work explores questions related to identity, belongingness, and representation, with a specific focus on media and Afghanistan. Dr. Hatif's research has examined the complex beauty industry in Afghanistan, as well as the development of independent media in the country and the representation of Afghans in the US media. And anyone who knows me knows I will have to mention that as also a fellow Fremontee from Fremont, California, and Little Kabul. So glad to have you on here, another fellow Fremont friend. So next we have Wajma Osman from Temple University, who is our keynote today and will be moderating tonight's discussion. And once again, Dr. Osman is an Afghan-American academic and filmmaker. She's an assistant professor in media studies and production at Temple University. And her book, Television in the Afghan Culture Wars, brought to you by foreigners, warlords, and activists, she analyzes the impact of international funding and cross-border media flows on the national politics of Afghanistan, the region, and beyond. She's also the co-director of the critically acclaimed documentary Postcards from Tora Bora and the co-author of the forthcoming Afghanistan, A Very Short Introduction. So thank you again, Dr. Osman, for joining us. I know you just wrapped up with class, so you're teaching, you did a keynote today. So I know it's a busy day for you. So again, we want to thank you for taking the time to do this and to be part of tonight's panel and helping us moderate. So again, we're very excited to have you join us today. And please make sure everyone who's listening, feel free to tweet out comments on YouTube, anything that you find interesting or questions throughout the panel. But I will go ahead and pass it off to Dr. Osman, who will be moderating tonight's session.
Yeah, thank you, Omar John. It has been indeed a long day where some of us are on Eastern Standard Time and some of us are on Pacific California time. But I'm excited to be here and I have some questions for Mishgan John and Azita John after their presentations, and we'll have plenty of time to open it up to those of you who are joining us on YouTube. So please do share comments and I'll let you take it away. Should we just jump in then?
Yeah, I think we should maybe just jump into the questions. Yeah.
All right, let's do that then. Okay, so let's start with you, Mishgan. You know, I'm as you know, I'm very excited about your dissertation and looking forward to it being out in book form soon. I know you have the article coming out in the Iranian Studies Journal. So I am familiar with your exciting work. And one of the things that you discuss in your work on music and culture in Afghanistan in the 60s and 70s is how Afghan women use their engagement in music, art, and cultural production as an act of resistance and agency. Could you please talk to us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the question, Wajma. And before I answer it, I want to also just thank Omar Aziz for all of his incredible organizational efforts to bring us together. It's really a pleasure and an honor to share this space with both you, Wajma, and with Dr. Azita Hatif. So to this question about Afghan women's cultural production in the realm of music and art and resistance, yeah, I want to start by saying that I think any act of a woman acknowledging her being and her capability is an act of resistance in the face of a world that's predominantly governed by a structure of patriarchy, whether we are sitting in Afghanistan or America or elsewhere. But why is it that Afghan women are highlighted as so exceptional in this regard? There's so many exceptionally weak, that they are so exceptionally weak and oppressed and in need of saving, as the rhetoric goes. We heard from Dr. Maria Hanoun yesterday, who detailed an entire history of Afghan women who needed no saving but forged opportunities for themselves. But to offer some examples of my own work and research where women have used the space of radio as resistance, one aspect of my research on radio in Afghanistan looks to women broadcasters, producers, and performers, figures like Anisa Latif Durrani, Farida Anwari is another famous example. Shukriya Rad, who has an Uzbek background and was the pioneer of Juandun magazine, one of the main pop culture magazines of the time, and who also pioneered children's radio programs. These women use their skill sets in ways that far surpassed their male counterparts. They were successful because they were innovative with the type of programming they brought to the radio. So, for example, women like Durrani and Anwari revolutionized the way the recitation of poetry was heard on a mass scale. And they did this by blending music with their voices that would inflect, it would pitch high and pitch low, and utter and show emotion through the words, but also through the poetry that they selected. Surely, these women drew from the canon of classical Persianate poets, including the beloved Maulana, or what much of the West knows as Rumi. You see, for centuries, Maulana's Masnavi, his magnum opus, or the collection of his works, captivated people from this region because of its ability to speak to multiple themes in life, of love, of loss, of separation, of wars, internal and external, and of humanity. And throughout the 1960s and 1970s, where Afghanistan experienced a series of political experiments between a constitutional monarchy, a republic, and eventually communism, censorship was real on the sound waves. But classical poetry, like that of Maulana, was an escape. It gave the audience the language to express their emotions during these tumultuous periods. One of the opening line of Maulana's Masnavi, Bishnaw az nai chun hikayat mekonad, az judayi ha shikayat mekonad. Listen to the story of the reed, of being separated and lamenting the pains of that separation. You know, these lines were not only passed through generations orally, but they became immortalized through the voices of these women that were reciting them on the airwaves and essentially consoling a population struggling to make sense of a world that pushed and pulled and separated them from things that were once familiar and taken away, from their rights to their homes to their sheer existence. And yes, this kind of poetry is resistance, and that's why it was even more evocative when women were reciting it. And song here is really important in sort of helping to preserve literature, because knowledge was passed and brokered through the oral traditions. And song was a way to memorize words, to pass them to one another, and to share them widely. So you could be someone sitting in Badakhshan or Kunduz or Bamyan with access to a radio and know this poem well because it was previously recited to you, or you heard it on the radio and you liked it so you remembered it. And you have the freedom to interpret the lyrics in ways that make sense to you. And I'm describing this transmission of knowledge in song because in the West, there's this stubborn fallacy. It's a stubborn fallacy that afflicts society's understanding of Afghanistan. And the presumptuous idea that the only history and culture Afghans have is one laced in war and violence is not only a gross generalization, but one that just hasn't bothered to hear history. That's precisely the challenge that I present in my work, because if we listen to it, we hear a pulse so palpable that it not only bleeds life, it heals life. Music is one avenue and path to listen to the past, but there are other life worlds through sound to be discovered if we are courageous enough to literally turn up the volume, for lack of a better metaphor, and listen to it.
Oh, Washma John, I think you are muted.
Oh, thank you for that. I didn't realize that. But I was saying thank you, Ms. Ganjan, for so eloquently describing the role of poetry and music and culture, the significance of it to Afghan people. And I think for non-Afghan people, they have a harder time understanding the role of it. But for most of us who grew up, with in Afghan families, from a young age, poetry is passed on, lyricism from generation to generation. And as you said, it also provided a subversive space, and it was an active resistance as well. Now, could you explain it, and then we'll move to Azida Jan, and then we'll come back to you. And Azida Jan, also feel free to add any questions as well. We can have more of a conversation too, if you'd like. Could you talk a little bit about, women's agency and active resistance taking, part in singing and reciting poetry and all of these other cultural productions that they engaged in the 1960s and 70s, which is the focus of your wonderful dissertation work. So on the one hand, there was them taking advantage of these opportunities and as an active agency and resistance. On the other hand, could you maybe explain a little bit about how the state came into this and how RTA, Radio Television Afghanistan, and before that Radio Kabul, basically the state broadcasting station, what role that played into all of this, as well as some of the initiatives that the state had put into place. But you also mentioned that there's, at the same time that they were creating these opportunities, there was censorship. So if you could maybe expand a little bit upon that.
Oh, Ms. Ganjan, you're muted.
I apologize for that. The time period, again, that I focus is on the 60s and 70s. And this period, as I mentioned, witnessed a series of tumultuous political and social happenings that deeply affected society and cultural production. And it was in 1964 that a new constitution gave way to a host of civil rights for the Afghan people, including equal rights for women and freedom of the press. Now, freedom of the press also translated into freedom of speech, which directly impacted radio and music production and other forms of art. And then a coup in 1973 led to a republic that inaugurated formal cultural institutions for film and theater and the performing arts. And by 1979, experiments with communism fused radio with television through the state-sponsored media corporation, Radio Television Afghanistan, and further popularized regional or Mahali, local and folk music. Now, what I tried to do with my oral histories and some of the archival research I've done is to piece together this history and try to understand the past through what was heard. The era that is sort of thought as the golden age of music, roughly from the 1950s through to the 1970s, refers to a time when the country was relatively stable and peaceful under the rule of King Mohammad Zahir Shah. And we really see how the administration supported and funded music and musicians and the radio itself. It's in 1964 that radio in Afghanistan acquires the technology, German transmitters that allow radio to expand its reach beyond Kabul and reach the entire country and further abroad internationally as to faraway places such as South Africa and Japan. There were listeners and supporters of the music of two major institutions in Kabul, the Royal Court and the radio station. So with regards to the royal court, it was under the rule of Amir Sher Ali Khan in the 19th century when North Indian musicians were invited to become court musicians in Kabul. They were given land in the section of Kabul known as the Kharabat, where they settled. And since that time, the Hindustani classical tradition of North India became established as sort of the elite art tradition of music in Afghanistan. Court patronage for musicians continued throughout the reign of Zahir Shah, who regularly invited Afghan and Indian artists and musicians to his court for private performances and music lessons for individual members of the royal family. Artists were given major awards and prizes, and the state really helped to elevate the status of musicians. So in addition to these professionally trained musicians, the radio station also employed amateur musicians, or what we call shauqi musicians, who were not trained in a particular school of music, but were talented and had some formal or informal knowledge of music. One of the musicians who I highlight in my work and research that was part of this amateur trend of musicians was the indelible Ahmad Zohir, who leaves a huge imprint on the Afghan musical repertoire. And there are many more in his milieu, both men and women, who are singing on the radio and experimenting with sound and with lyrics and music and in all sorts of ways. So in this population of diverse ethnic and linguistic groups, where there is a high rate of illiteracy and lacking access to other forms of media, radio really became, in a sense, sort of a unifying force for the nation, providing programming in the various languages of Afghanistan. The state employed master musicians who, like other government bureaucrats, enjoyed official sanction and prestige and support. They recruited female singers, mainly from the elite classes, in order to raise the status of women in the entertainment world. Radio musicians, with the help of some foreign advisors, developed a musical style that combined stylistic elements and melodies from classical court music and regional folk traditions. A national orchestra was formed, and throughout sort of this, I think when we look to the current moment in Afghanistan, throughout sort of the unimaginable pain and suffering Afghans have endured in the past 40 years, you look to the music of the past and you see how this music helped them sustain their identity and culture. Now, to the second part of your question, in terms of, okay, well, we have a state that in this time period through the 60s and 70s was supporting a cultural production in the realm of the arts and music. There was also absolutely definitely censorship. So how are people dealing with this? And one of the examples that I looked to and speak about in the dissertation, that is forming into my monograph now, is the example of Ahmad Zohir. And so as sort of the politics of the country are changing in the late 70s, Ahmad Zohir, I think, from the mid-70s onwards, he starts to sing more politically charged songs. And sometimes his music is censored because lyrics, the Ministry of Information and Culture, under which radio, television, and Radio Afghanistan falls under their purview, they are being highly strict about what is being aired on the radio. And they're looking at the lyrics very, very carefully. And so Ahmad Zohir knows this. And so some of his music does definitely get censored. And is circulated through other means, through cassettes and through informal means. But the ones that do pass the censors, he cleverly subverts the state by choosing lyrics that they would approve and choosing from a canon of poets that they would approve. So in the late 1970s, he chooses, and one of his most famous ballads that I'm sure many of us know, Zindagi Akhir Sarayat, Life Will Eventually End. The lyrics are from Abul Qasim al-Lahuti, who is a communist poet laureate. And he uses these lyrics to talk about the oppression of the state and rising up against the state. And he's able to pass the censors because of the poetry he's chosen. And so there's so many incredible examples of musicians subverting and passing through the censors. And I think even if we look to today's period, in the course of the past 20 years, music is still the space where where we can see a lot of resistance and a lot of Afghan agency.
Thank you, Ms. Ganjan. I think I can speak for many of us that were very looking forward and eagerly awaiting your monograph. So rich, and I'm sure those of us who've joined us, the audience, will have questions for you too. But in the meantime, let's also move on to Azida Jan, Dr. Atif. In your excellent article where you do a content analysis of the representation of Afghan women in the New York Times, called Media and Intervention, Examining Representations of Afghan Women in the New York Times. You focus on those representations, and your analysis shows that it's a very particular type that the U.S. media, particularly the New York Times and mainstream media, shows. So could you talk about the link of that with the war and how it shaped the war, and just generally what some of your analysis and conclusions are, please?
Yes, absolutely. So thank you so much for everyone at UCR for bringing us together. I'm really excited to be in the space with you all and in community with one another. So the work that I've been thinking about here, so my own research with Dr. Rose Lakou, we looked at news coverage of Afghan women in the New York Times from 2001 to 2018. And what initially had drawn us to this analysis was coverage in 2017 suggesting that the newly elected president in the US, Trump, with advice from National Security Advisor McMaster, decided to keep troops in Afghanistan after reportedly being shown these black and white photographs of Afghan women in miniskirts from the 1970s, which I think many of us may be familiar with these photographs and how they are brought up often, in a sense, at times meant to almost illustrate this progressive moment in Afghanistan's history, which is in fact much more complicated than that, but nevertheless is brought up oftentimes to kind of help elicit these certain types of emotional responses. And so in the US, what we've seen in kind of thinking about, there's almost an obsession with this of sorts with Afghan women and their bodies, and thinking about how visible this was in the early days of the invasion. So we set out to understand how coverage of women was framed throughout the period of this war on terror, this war in Afghanistan. And so over a 17-year period, we identified some critical points of media coverage, especially as it relates to women and intervention and some of these different conversations around it too. And our analysis, of course, found 3 moments that were particularly critical and also illustrated this heightened coverage of Afghan women in the times, which also happened to correspond with military decisions too. The first very obviously came in 2001 with President Bush's decision to invade the country, where coverage really focused on what we oftentimes hear as liberating or saving Afghan women. And thematically, what we start to see here with coverage during this year is that included a general positive feel while simultaneously presenting the U.S. as a saving force, which of course was this idea of, here's the U.S. bringing Afghan women freedom. And so within news coverage during this period, the veil was frequently used as a symbol of repression by effective removal, a symbol of freedom. And so news coverage appeared fixated on the veil, right? And we start to see this continually, at times even so when it was very irrelevant to coverage, but clearly attempted to portray a very specific framework. And so there was an influx, as we saw naturally, with news coverage of Afghanistan during this period, illustrating the situation of women. And of course, what we see leading up to this point, up to the invasion with news coverage, and in this moment in 2001 and on, is a way to really build support for the invasion and justifying, in a sense, almost the war too. And so the second peak that we really noticed took place in 2010 under a different administration, under President Obama, with these decisions to keep military troops in the country and increase it to the highest number at that point. And so while focus of Afghan women in 2001 presented them as vulnerable and needing to be saved, coverage of women in 2010 took on a very similar frame, but rested upon the notion of continuing military presence in the country by pointing to some of the gains in women's rights. And so coverage of Afghan women during this time highlight the progress while simultaneously creating a picture of the Taliban that was very similar to what we had seen in early 2001. And so as the invasion of Afghanistan attempted to garner support through this narrative of saving Afghan women, the decision to remain in the country was supported by this need almost to continue protecting Afghan women. And so this third and final peak that we identified in our coverage took place in 2017. When President Trump's decision to keep troops in the country, where coverage began to shift and, in a sense, almost reckon with this rhetoric that was brought up in early 2001 around saving Afghan women. And coverage of women towards the end of this time frame provided more critical voices, as a number of articles were written by journalists based in Afghanistan too, where they explore the nuances of women's lived experiences. However, we do start to see these dominant narratives that are framed oftentimes around violence still being the part that comes through. And so intended or not, and what I mean here is, often this could be part of journalistic practices or the socialization about reporting on the war on terror, that this coverage, of course, has reinforced a lot of these stereotypes and tropes that we see of Afghanistan. And so over the 17-year period, we identified exactly how Afghan women have been strategic tools to shape public opinion about the war on terror. And so within this coverage, the Times seldom provided critical analyses of how Afghan women are affected by U.S. policies and strategies. And instead, what we see are coverage that highlight Afghan women's continued oppression. This is what you see over an extended period of time too. And this perspective highlights the violence that women may experience, but does so at times to frame these atrocities as inherent to Afghan culture. And so by doing so, intervention here is also very much justified. And so the same rhetoric of saving Afghan women that became so prevalent in 2001 continued to frame media coverage throughout this period. And so what we start to see is that coverage at times may vary, but the messages very much remain the same. And so by portraying Afghan women through such limited frameworks, not only removes their agency and complexity of identity, but also plays into these larger narratives of othering. And so with this, the war in Afghanistan, which was once presented from the U.S. perspective as this moral duty to liberate Afghan women. And what we see here with the U.S., in a sense, completing its military mission with so little care or concern for Afghan women's lives supports, the point that we've been thinking through here about how Afghan women have served as ideological justification for the U.S. in its interest in the country, and one that is oftentimes reinforced year in year over and over again by media too.
Thank you, Azida John. It looks like in the comments people are interested. It's a very interesting article with excellent data. So if you could share a link, some people would like a link to the article.
Absolutely.
I'll ask you one more question, and then in the interest of opening it up to the audience, I will end there. And also, if you have any questions for one another, or Omar John and Ali John have any questions for you as well. So following up, on your explanation of these three different moments in the New York Times analysis that you did, where the representation directly correlated with war and the agenda of the war. Um, how can journalists do a better job, or what um, solutions or suggestions do you have for journalists and media makers to do a better job, essentially reporting on Afghanistan, um, and including the current crisis and humanitarian situation?
Absolutely. So, as someone who teaches journalism and whose work focuses on the representations of Afghans within US media, I've been thinking a lot recently about how media, specifically US media, have framed the withdrawal and the ongoing humanitarian crisis. And of course, related to this, as I speak here, I want to also discuss how it is that we think about how journalists can do a better job here of covering Afghanistan, how it is that we can also elevate the voices of journalists in the country too, by doing so and advocating for them as well. And so, as I just discussed, we know that media coverage in Afghanistan is closely linked to military decisions. So if we look at news coverage prior to 9/11, there was very little concern or coverage, especially around gender-based violence. As we know, news coverage in Afghanistan skyrocketed after 2001, right? If we take a look at any type of news coverage prior to 2001, there was one study by Sable and Kumar who found that there's just 29 newspaper articles written about women. And so when we compare that to the type of coverage that emerged after 9/11, there are these stark differences. And so we start to see here that the ways in which Afghans, of course, have been used as visual and rhetorical tool to build support for the war in Afghanistan too. And so the framing of the war on terror that long portrayed Afghans through these one-dimensional frameworks, for example, Afghan women as simply oppressed and Afghan men as dangerous. What we see is that these portrayals are still found in coverage and are echoed from those in the highest levels of US government. We can think back to a speech that was given not too long ago by President Biden, who really played up a lot of these different tropes that we hear, kind of thinking about the graveyard of empires, kind of what we oftentimes hear as like these different stereotypes attached to Afghanistan. And so as military interests dissipate, we know that so does news coverage, and perhaps we're already witnessing that in real time with the formal withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan in August. However, media, of course, have a responsibility to the Afghan people and to the rest of the world to fairly report on what is happening and the increasing humanitarian crisis too. And so there are a few ways to do so responsibly that both elevates the voices of Afghans as well as advocates for journalists in the country too. Of course, we can begin by thinking about centering Afghan voices. We've got to reflect upon who gets to speak for the Afghan people. So given the military mission, it's common to have government officials discuss the situation in Afghanistan. However, these individuals may not be able to speak to the lived experiences of the most vulnerable. As the Taliban took over province by province a couple of months ago, I watched as a number of broadcasts in the US had invited military veterans and retired officials as experts on Afghanistan, where they were asked about how the Afghan people must be feeling in this moment, right? And so to actually know what the Afghan people feel, we need to speak with them. When you're spoken for rather than spoken with, the narrative will bend towards maintaining the status quo, or worse, perpetuating injustice against the most vulnerable. In my own research, we found that coverage over the 17-year period began to shift a bit in 2017 and onwards, as reports were emerging from Afghanistan directly, where women's voices became a critical part of that coverage, and it was a bit more qualitative in a sense. In addition to supporting the work of journalists in the country, the international journalism community needs to provide awareness, partnerships, funding, and diplomatic pressure too. And so what can this look like, right? If we're, for example, to think of in terms of partnerships, The Guardian recently partnering with Roxana Media to help amplify news coverage is one way to really elevate the voices of Afghans and journalists in the country. And so when we think about media in the U.S., it's often so it oversimplifies and decontextualizes international news. And so from the U.S. media perspective, it's critical to undo the rhetoric around the war on terror that has largely framed the U.S. war in Afghanistan through a very limited lens. And I think something that has come up throughout our conversation this evening really outlines the critical role of media and the press within a society. It's the symbiotic relationship of sorts. So when there's an attack on media, we see that it sounds the alarm here for other aspects of society too. And so the attack on journalists, the removal of women from their positions within media reflects much larger issues here within Afghan society too. And so the attempts to silence media and the attacks on journalists without standing too deterministic here illustrates some of the power of media too. And so thinking about this, it's critical for media in Afghanistan to operate freely, and it will take, of course, in addition to what folks are doing on the ground, the international community to apply pressure to help realize this goal too.
Thank you, Azita Jan. Very important analysis. And I also want to, you pointed out centering Afghan and Afghan American voices, but especially people on the ground, centering those voices and elevating those voices is key at the moment. And I also want to commend Omar and Ali and the Middle Eastern Student Center and organizing this panel. They've done a great job centering the voices of Afghans and Afghan Americans, which is not center. And organizing this panel, they've done a great job. So let's open it up to audience questions and comments. I don't see any in the comments right now. I have some more questions, but this is also an opportunity for those of you who are joining us to please share any comments or questions for Dr. Musami and Dr. Atif, if you have any, and for questions for Omar and Ali also, if you want to jump in. I have some more questions, like I said, but let's, and if you have any questions for each other as well, please go ahead. Well, maybe while we're waiting, I'll ask another question for Mishgan Jan. You know, in your work, you've done these incredible oral histories with talent from the 60s and 70s. You know, people who we consider national treasures, and we've lost so much talent due to displacement, becoming refugees, people being killed, as you point out. And could you talk a little bit more about why you went with that approach and started your important oral histories, and you know, how that's shaped, or you know, what the relationship of that is to the archives? I mean, you are a historian by profession and training, and you have mentioned before how the archive, or the problems of the archive, and its entrenchment and imperial knowledge production, and hence also creating your own by doing oral histories.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the question, Wajmajan. So really, when I began this project and focusing on the radio, there were a couple of things that I came up against. One is trying to sort of piece together some of a history that has been lost, because the time period between 1979 up to 2001 was quite a tumultuous period. And unfortunately, war meant a lot of destruction, and not just physical destruction, but also intellectual destruction, because important people either passed away or they left the country, and sort of trying to map out and gain access to former employees of radio and television Afghanistan took me to all sorts of places all over the world. In addition to sort of tapping into the diaspora communities here in the United States, where there are large hubs of there's a large hub here in the Bay Area. Lots of actually Afghan musicians from the 60s and 70s ended up migrating here to California. There's a large hub in Virginia. There's some sprinkled throughout the East Coast. I also went to England. I went to Canada. I went to Tajikistan. I went to Afghanistan. I went to India in search of trying to piece together this history. And so one of the things that I think is important to understand is that if you are a scholar or an inspiring scholar of history, and you're being trained in the West, you'll notice that much, not all, there's a growing other kind of body of scholarly literature, but much of the literature that has been produced, historical literature that has been produced on and about Afghanistan has been highly problematic for the tropes and for the ways in which it has pieced together an Afghan past. And I say highly problematic because Afghans have been relegated oftentimes to the holy trifecta of nation, tribe, religion, the state, and getting out of that grip has been a challenge, because it set a certain discourse to understand Afghans and Afghanistan. And so when you relegate it to these highly problematic categories and you say, well, you know, it's so simple and easy to understand these people through these tropes, and they're warriors. This is the graveyard of empires, and we can only understand them through these highly problematic lenses that don't lend themselves to diversity, that don't lend themselves to understanding what, I don't know, culture or Afghan people are like on the ground. It becomes a way to stereotype and essentialize people. Now, Afghanistan is not the only country that sort of suffers from this type of produced literature, but other parts of the global South, and particularly Muslim countries, are also afflicted by this. But there's been an abundance of wonderful scholars in those fields producing new literature. And I'd like to think that for Afghanistan and for global history, I hope that my contribution shows a different side and sort of contributes to cutting across this literature. But going back to collecting oral histories and the problem of attempting to sort of decolonize what we know about this part of the world and its region, you know, I think for me, looking to music and also realizing that the literature that I had read wasn't representative of my lived experiences at all, or anything that I knew of my history or culture. Looking to music kind of helped me narrate and tell and show through proof a different kind of understanding that hasn't that some scholars are beginning to add incredible texture and layer to, showing the transnational connections of this area, going beyond this idea that Afghanistan is this isolated place unto its own. And there's something about the quality of music, its boundless nature, that allows us to see that and goes away from these tropes of isolation and sort of these stereotypes that Afghanistan hasn't been engaged with the world. And then there's also another interesting thing about sort of exploring sound and trying to distill a history through it. How sounds change. How does traditional sounds that, the rubab and the harmonium and the regional richak, how does that mix in with global sounds? Where are these global sounds coming from? How does that get into this place that we've rendered as impenetrable? That Afghanistan is this impenetrable place. How does then music give us a different story and by listening, we have a different narrative. And so I think that it's so important for us to continue to keep a very critical eye into the way that Afghans are being represented. And I think Azita Jan's work does this in the line of journalism. I think your work does this in the line of looking at television for different interpretations of how we can understand Afghans and Afghanistan. And I think it's so important to continue to question received wisdom and not accept it as a truth tale, and to push back on things that just don't sound like they're relatable to you. And I encourage my students in the classroom to do that irrespective of where they're from. And I tell them, I say, if you're reading something, if you're reading like a so-called comprehensive history of a land or a place, if that's even possible to produce a comprehensive history of a land or a place, look to the parts that you identify with or not. What is in there that you identify with, or that you can question and give more texture to? And I think that's so important for scholarship being produced about Afghanistan's past and its current present.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
I know we have questions. Is there an echo? No, that's me. If other folks want to go on mute real quick, there's one, John, that might help. Or Ali, if you want to spotlight me, Ali, our technical guru in the background. I don't know if that will help folks, but so we have a bunch of questions in the YouTube that I wanted to make sure we got to, some of them. This was a question that I was also wondering about, and Dr. Hanoun, who was one of our panelists yesterday, also has this question for Azita Jan. So Dr. Hatif, in the last 20 years, social media technologies have made media so different. And have you explored how this impacts or changes the discourse of representation? I know that your work, you've done a lot of work with social media and activism in other places in the world, but how do you see that impacting Afghanistan, or maybe how has that impacted Afghanistan in the last 20 years or so?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. So I haven't looked specifically in my own research at social media use in Afghanistan, but I have been thinking about these questions a lot as they relate widely to how it is that social media is used, especially by minoritized groups, and that's widely defined too. And so I think social media, in a lot of ways, there is incredible nuance. We see the ways in which it provides folks a place to negotiate individual and collective identities. And we see this relationship that's very closely connected between media and identity, which is a dance of sorts, not always in rhythm, but we see how it allows folks a space to see themselves and to be able to speak for oneself too. And so I think with social media in particular, there have been incredible ways in which it has been used in the past number of years in Afghanistan, especially by women. I think the organizing that was taking place after the murder of Farkhunda a few years ago was an important way in which organizers came together. And I think this is a really important component of social media, especially for groups when there are hostile responses to their organizing in public spaces, how they can utilize these alternative spaces that can be private in some ways to be able to engage in that organizing, to bring people together, to have a following that then can also help in the organization of protests, right? We saw one of the largest protests take place after her murder. A lot of this has to, I think an important part of the conversation is thinking about the organization that takes place in these particular sites. I also think there are a lot of, in thinking about the nuance here about issues of access that may come along with social media use too, right? I think there is especially a lot to be said about the recent campaign on Twitter of "Don't Touch My Clothes," for example, whose voices are visible, and in these discussions, what such a focus on women's dress means too. But we can also identify the purpose of these mediated spaces in providing folks a place to negotiate their identities and create awareness around perhaps the situation in Afghanistan. And the hope is that along with this visibility, there are demands for action too. But I think that particular campaign gets more to the area of what diaspora are doing in particular. But I think it raises this important question of accessibility, which is an incredible challenge, of course. So I think there's great nuance here. I think there are a lot of affordances to social media, but I think it's important to identify some of these drawbacks too. And so I think my hope is in kind of thinking about social media use, especially in today's day and age, is how we can harness this tool in particular ways in the fight for justice, right? Especially as it does relate to women in Afghanistan too.
Thank you. And if it's okay, I'm going to come back to you with another question. So we have here Ping Su Alice Lin, who asks about the appropriation of Afghans' pain and suffering as a rhetorical device in the American-led campaign during the War on Terror. So they ask, how have these spectacles of terror in U.S. media differed from the early 2000s through the 2010s to the recent fall of Kabul? And how does Bush media compare with his successors?
Yeah. Yeah, so in thinking about some of the constructions of how it is that, sorry, I'm taking a look at the question. Yeah, and so I think there has been a shift, especially in the way in which Afghans in Afghanistan have been represented from the 2000s, where there is this very specific focus on thinking about these binary ways in which Afghans are oftentimes presented, right, as oppressed or as simply dangerous. And so these have oftentimes kind of fed into this rhetoric around the war on terror, which I think there was a slight shift that was taking place between media coverage in the early 2000s and 2010s. But if we're thinking about, from our perspective of the research, thinking about Afghan women in particular and how they are represented in this coverage, there is still a very heavy focus on this theme that came through in 2001. This idea that, yes, there's this dominant frame of needing to liberate Afghan women that we saw in the early 2000s. But that thread came through in 2010 too, right? and especially in how it is that women were presented. I think recently, I think to the recent fall of Kabul, I think it would be incredibly interesting to kind of think about how the coverage has looked in the past month or so. I would imagine we can kind of see this, and there's a lot of research that kind of supports this point where the questions of military decisions in Afghanistan are closely linked to how it is that the country also, the US in particular, reports on Afghan women. So there's a strong connection between the two, and there's oftentimes, the similar theme that runs right throughout these different administrations, whether it was Bush, whether it was Obama or Trump. We see this narrative kind of guide through all of these different timeframes and administrations. And I think what would be particularly interesting is kind of thinking about now, 2001, August, what type of coverage has emerged here. And I think what we start to see is, I would imagine, a similar tone, but not as much care or concern given here, especially given how it is that women have oftentimes been used in a sense, right, in this coverage too, as a very strategic tool to kind of push forward a military mission. But with the military mission, in a sense, no longer being there, that starts to shift a bit too.
I think we'll all be looking forward to more of that research and that analysis. And I think, you're the perfect person to help us understand that and look through, how that has changed or what it looks like now in comparison to the early 2000s. We have some sort of really fun, not slightly fun questions, I think, in the YouTube page that I actually wanted to make sure we got to, because I thought there were some interesting questions that maybe we can do a quick sort of rapid fire as we wrap up. So I'm going to start with the question for Mujgan Jan from Samia Karimi, who said, Mujgan Jan, so grateful for you shining a light on the role of music in Afghan society. If you could ask Ahmad Zair only one question, what would it be? Or any other Afghan musician on radio waves?
Wow, Samia Jan, thank you so much for the question. That's hard. I think I would probably ask Ahmad Zair, how he knew. And I would ask him that question of how he knew, because his songs really, the repertoire of his songs, the catalog, the archive of the songs that we have, narrate Afghanistan's history through the course of 2 decades. And he was just incredibly insightful, predicting all sorts of things that unraveled even to the current moment. So I would ask him, how did he know?
That's a big question, but a very interesting one. So thank you for tackling that. The next question I wanted to ask from, I think it's LJB265. So I'm going to ask everybody this question, and we'll start with, how about if we could start with Wajma Jan, and then we'll go to Azita Jan, and then Mujgan Jan, you can end it. But how, tell us a favorite piece of music, television, art from the panelists, since they said you are all experts on our culture. So if you have something that you think is a personal favorite, or you think something that we should, engage with, what is it for you? So Dr. Osman, we'll start with you.
I'll keep with, I have a lot of television recommendations, but I'll keep with the music theme because, as Mujgan Jan explained, there's so much amazing Afghan music that was created during the golden era that many of the younger musicians are now recreating and adding their own twists on. But I'm a big Ahmad Zair fan. There's many of his songs that come to mind right now, but one of the ones that I like a lot is Man Mastam Tudewana. I'm drunk or wild and you're crazy. But the rest of it is like, who's going to take us home? And the lyricism in all of his music is beautiful, as is another favorite is Ustad Mawash, who, as Mishgan Jan talks about in her work, was one of the first women to get the honorific Ustad, had reached a new level of musical professionalism. And I really like the poetry and music there too, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so I'll mention I just ordered some vinyl of Ahmad Zaid. So I'm excited to kind of hear that in that sound. I think there's something about the specific sound that comes through, the crackling, the raspiness that I think is so beautiful and kind of just transports me to a different time. But I think, you know, to be completely honest, and I think my love for reality television is something that guides my response here too. I love the different types of shows. I know whenever I go home, Rodarol is going to be on TV, which is, you know, the take on Family Feud in Afghanistan. And I always am so interested by that. And I know Dr. Osman had talked about this earlier in the different genres, and we can talk about these adaptations of global products and how they are very much localized and how these translate into particular places. So if I get a chance, I do appreciate the reality television in Afghanistan, just from, you know, the perspective of how interesting it is to see these flows of information around the world, but also from just my love of reality television.
Yeah, so I would say that I'm a big sucker for Afghan folk music, folkloric songs that we all know, from Bya ke burim ba mazar Mullah Muhammad Jan, Laili Laili Jan Dil ma kardi wairan, Ala Shakuko Jan Kandari ra qurban, Ro Ro Qida Qadamuna Hashna. I mean, all of these folk songs, right? They've persisted and they've existed on and on through this land for, you know, so many years that surpass all of us. And I just think it's amazing that they're sustained and many of us know them. I'd say recently one of the most beautiful songs that makes me quite emotional, and I think has caught on throughout Afghans inside the country and outside because of its beautiful lyrics, is of course Dawood Sarkhush's beautiful song Sarzamin Man, Sarzamin Man khasta khasta az jafai, Sarzamin Man be surud o be sadai, which basically translates to, my country, you're tired of your grief and suffering. My country, you're without a song and without a voice. And it's very relatable. But I have to say also in the realm of television, man, I mean, I really enjoyed and loved watching Khat Seom. Wajma Jan speaks about this in her work, but I just think it's incredible because it really, I mean, the saying goes, art imitates life, life imitates art. But I think if we want a representation of some of the things that Afghans in Afghanistan have grappled with, these various different forces, in a very diverse way, in terms of the different issues that show addresses and brings to light, I think it was just done so excellently. And I think there are clips available on YouTube to watch. And I just really enjoyed and loved that series. And I was hoping to watch the next season, but we'll see.
So thank you all for sharing. I mean, it was nice to kind of hear what you all are, you know, interested in and what you've been doing. I feel like I personally, you know, never, you know, don't always have the grasp of the language to really understand the lyrics to the depth that I think that, especially with Afghan music, but it always takes me to like a place of nostalgia and just kind of growing up and with the Afghan culture, with my family. So I am, this is a nice kind of sort of trip down memory lane. And even though I don't always understand the lyrics, it still invokes a certain emotion that it's just kind of hard to explain. And I think that also speaks to, I just want to again thank you all for taking the time to share so much about what we've seen in Afghanistan, and how in particular the media and culture has been used to resist different whether it's stereotypes or other things that have been put as being a form of resistance for many people in Afghanistan. And so, I'm curious to sort of see what the future holds. And I think this talk, I think, can kind of help us be more informed sort of consumers of media, whether it's through the journalistic representations of Afghans in the media, and and how they're being portrayed, and how that can and is used to justify, war and violence in Afghanistan, and also just kind of helping us look at the way our history, Mujgan Jan kind of talked about of how much music and art has been as part of the resistance and part of their ability to kind of shape and change and the culture, and also share sort of the diversity and the beauty of the culture. So I know we didn't have a lot of time to share. There's so much more we could talk about and get into, and but I want to encourage folks to follow these individuals, follow Dr. Osman, Dr. Hatef, and Dr. Masumi, because there's so much knowledge and such a wealth of knowledge and information and scholarship that I think so many of us can learn from, whether we are Afghan or not, and then just kind of understanding the people of Afghanistan. And so I want to just encourage folks to follow them on their Twitters and social media. So we will post their information on our YouTube page. So please make sure to check them out and hear their takes and their views on Afghanistan and the way things are, things are changing, and so I'm, they're a great resource for folks to check out. So I want to thank them again. We're wrapping up day 2 of the Afghanistan Symposium 20 years later, and just want to once again thank our guests today, Dr. Wajma Osman, Dr. Azita Hatef, and Dr. Mujgan Masumi. They have just provided us such incredible information. Make sure you're all looking up their scholarship and work, whether it's on social media or wherever you may find it. Get their books, get anything that has their name on it. And we want to thank the audience for joining us today. Please, we want to remind you all to join us again tomorrow. Tomorrow, we will be interviewing Azmat Khan, who is a journalist who's worked with the New York Times and has done some really, really incredible reporting on Afghanistan in the last 20 years, and actually is going to be interviewing us from Afghanistan. She is actually in Afghanistan right now. So we'll be hearing from her and Dr. Noor Sadiq, and then also we'll be interviewing her during our keynote tomorrow. And then we'll have our panelists in the evening that we are very excited about. And so we will take a look and take a dive into the last 20 years in particular, about the way the war has impacted the people of Afghanistan, the human toll, the financial toll, and what that's looked like. So I'm really excited for tomorrow's panel, and have been very thankful and grateful to everyone who joined us thus far. The last thing I want to do is just once again plug the UC Riverside's crowdfunding campaign, to make sure that you donate to help bring Afghan scholars to UC Riverside and come and continue their studies and scholarship here. And please make sure you follow the MESC, the Middle Eastern Student Center at UC Riverside, on Twitter, on Instagram, and stay up to date with everything happening with the Afghanistan Symposium. So please keep up to date, and we will see you all tomorrow, 12 o'clock Pacific, 3 o'clock Eastern time. and look forward to seeing you all then. Have a wonderful night, and thank you once again to all of our wonderful panelists.